Hello and good morning, everybody. My name is Dean Quick. I'm the board-certified music therapist for Levine Cancer Institute, and this is Music Therapy for Self-Care, where weekdays I go live at 10 a.m. and chat about music, play some music for you. Mondays and Fridays, I do some live looping, where I just kind of create music for you to use however you'd like, and it's live, which means it's usually better. And Tuesdays and Thursdays are days that I share music, and typically I play that music live. And I've been going back and forth with this idea for a little bit on metal. It's something that I can't recreate with just me and my digital audio workstation. It's just not within my skill set. As someone who enjoys metal as much as I do, and I dare say it's probably my longest running favorite genre. There's a lot of other genres of music that I enjoy, but metal has always been there. I've always enjoyed heavy music, and I'll get into some of the reasons why metalheads are metalheads, and then we'll go from there. But first, thanks for tuning in, and if you haven't subscribed yet, go ahead and subscribe on YouTube. That helps me out a lot, and we'll get into it. So all that to say, I can't recreate metal live for you, but what I can do is play some recordings and provide some commentary on said music. And the structure of this is something that I've been playing around with for the past few weeks, thinking about how to present it in the best way. And went back and forth with, maybe it should be that I start in like the origins of metal, and I don't want to do that. That seems a little, too history class-like. Anytime I speak about something, I'd like to bring a sense of passion to it. And so I figured I would start with the metal that I'm passionate about. So you heard in the very beginning this instrumental jam here. You didn't hear my intro music. You heard this. And this is a group called Scale the Summit, and this is their song called Atlas Novus. They're an instrumental metal band, which is awesome. I saw them in Charlotte. They opened up for Between the Buried and Me, and at the Fillmore, and a mosh pit broke out. And they were like, no one ever moshes to our music, which you can understand. Listen, that's pretty toned down. Not in some definitions metal, but more progressive rock. But what makes it metal is that it is heavier. There is distortion there, and some of the other musical elements make it metal. So what I wanted to start with today is the metal that I'm most passionate about. And if you've spent any time with me personally, you probably know that my favorite all-time band is Tool. And any of my patients that I see that are watching definitely know this. And because I've used the music in groups before, because their lyrical content can be just as grabbing as the music. So Tool is a progressive rock / progressive metal band. And a couple of other progressive metal bands are Between the Buried and Me, and then there's another one called Devin Townsend Project, which Devin Townsend was in a band before called Strapping Young Lad. Anyways, so I want to talk about those three and give some examples of it. Then there's groove metal, and Lambofgod is a groove metal band that I like a lot. And then there's another subgenre of metal that I love called deathcore, and I want to talk about the band chealseagrin and As Blood Runs Black. today. But first, I want to, kind of going to go back and then talking about the elements of metal. So what we have the band structure. It's a typical rock band structure, and it's changing a little bit in the digital world, right? The more we use technology in music, the more we're going to get things like synth in metal, and sound is one of those genres where you'll see you'll see synthesizers being used. So, and it looks like I may be having some connection issues here. Of course, when I'm so excited to talk about metal, I'll have broadcast issues. What's up with that? Looks like the internet's a little bogged down. So the band structure for metal bands is typically like rock band styles. A bass player, drummer, sometimes one of the other members of the band as the lead vocalist. More times than not, though, you will see a dedicated frontman or front woman, because there's styles of metal that are dedicated to female vocalists, and that's really cool too, which I'll get into in part 2 of my discussion on metal. So let's see. So we got the band structure down. You'll also find in the music heavy distortion, right? So the guitars are going to sound heavy. Here's an example, a great example of it. Heavy distortion here. And this is right out the gate. Yeah, see that. Ashley, I might have to, as much as I don't want to do this, I might have to start it back over. I'm not sure what's going on with my connection today. So that guitar is a distorted guitar. That is a pretty classic example. Okay. And then, so heavy distortion, fast drums, which you also kind of hear fast drums there, but it's nothing like the fast drums that are here. Here we go. So very fast bass drums. I'm trying to be mindful of explicit language, which is also an element of metal, which leads me into the lyrics. So the lyrical content of metal ranges drastically. So you'll have someone like Tool, who in their music, like there's a Tool song called 46 and 2, and it's one of my favorites because it breaks down parts of Carl Jung's perceptions of shadow and persona. But the song I want to really talk about is called Lateralis. It is my favorite recorded song of all time. And I'm going to read the lyrics, and I'm going to give you a little bit of the music too. Black, then white are all I see in my infancy. Red and yellow then came to be, reaching out to me, lets me see. So when we're born, the cones in our eyes that allow us to see color, that's the order in which they develop. black, then white, then red and yellow. And then as below, so above and beyond I imagine, drawn beyond the lines of reason, push the envelope, watch it bend. Overthinking, overanalyzing separates the body from the mind, withering my intuition, missing opportunities, and I must feed my will to feel my moment drawing way outside the lines. I love that. So then it repeats the first verse again, going in, continue, and then feed my will to feel this moment urging me to cross the line, reaching out to embrace the random, reaching out to embrace whatever may come. I embrace my desire to feel the rhythm, to feel connected enough to step aside and weep like a widow, to feel inspired, to fathom the power, to witness the beauty, to bathe in the fountain, to swing on the spiral, to swing on the spiral, to swing on the spiral of our divinity and still be a human. With my feet upon the ground, I lose myself between the sounds and open wide to suck it in. I feel it move across my skin. I'm reaching up and reaching out. I'm reaching for the random or whatever will bewilder me, And following our will and wind, we may just go where no one's been. We'll ride the spiral to the end and may just go where no one's been. Spiral out. Keep going. Amazing. You know, it's all about being connected with the experience, connected with rhythm, connected with music. And here's how it sounds, right? So I'll skip around, which I hate to do. But so here's the beginning. Got a long intro here. Which Tool's kind of known for having longer pieces of music. And thankfully at this part, and I don't want to jinx myself, it looks like my broadcast has stabilized. So it looks like we got a good connection going there. Thanks for the heads up on that, Ashley. Okay, so we got the intro. I'm going to let you get to that first little introduction. The introduction to the verses, I should say. Or the chorus. So we have distorted guitar here. And what makes this progressive metal versus groove metal or deathcore is you have a lot going on rhythmically that's not so straightforward. And that's probably the most lay way I can say it outside of, knowing music theory. So we'll listen to the first chorus, and then I want you to hear this other part where you can really hear it kind of defines some of the more progressive metal elements. So that's a little bit of Lateralis there. I'm going to try and skip around and find... Yeah, so there's a couple, they're called time signatures, right? So most of the time when you're listening to popular music, it's going to be in 4/4 or 3/4 or a variation of 3/4, which is 6/8. So what's going on here is you have some time signatures overlapping each other. So Maynard James Keenan is singing in a time signature different than the guitar player, different than the bass player, different from the drummer. So essentially they're all playing in different time signatures. And one thing that Tool does beautifully is they do it in a way that you can still kind of, vibe with it. You can groove with it. But it's also done in a way where you can really get lost in it too. So I'm going to skip ahead a little bit. Here you go. Still asymmetrical. So you can hear the bass. Guitar. Drums. So when I was thinking about progressive metal, I feel so bad talking over this song because it's almost sacred to me. I hate to fade it out, especially at that part. But you can hear, like, it's not conventional music. There's something different about it, and the lyrical content is metaphoric as much as it's direct. And for progressive metal, you have all these different variations in time signature. You have what's called asymmetrical time signatures, where you can't just go 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. So you have that. So we talked about the lyrical content varying greatly. There's a whole mystical side of metal too. You'll see, particularly in part 3, because I'm playing in 3 parts of this series on metal. Doom metal, you'll hear a lot about kind of science fiction and fantastical imagery, but doom metal is also, some people call some parts of doom metal stoner rock. So you'll hear some glorification of drug use and that kind of thing, which violence and drug use and all that is what people associate with metal, but that's not what it's all about. You listen to most styles of music, there's going to be references to drugs. I mean, most pop music and club bangers that you hear nowadays are glorifying party life and drugs, and metal is really all about validating the individual experience, and a lot of it is about deep emotional expression. So expressing rage, you may talk about violence, but you're not talking about violence towards others. And then anywhere in between, I mean, you'll have some party metal music. Thinking Andrew WK, which wasn't really metal, but kind of electronic dance music. Anyways, he's awesome, Party Hard, Andrew WK. Another example of progressive metal is Between the Buried and Me. And here's a song that I'm also going to use to describe an aspect of metal, which is called the drop, which you might be familiar from other styles of music like dubstep. So you hear the distorted guitar. You also have fast drums, relatively fast drums. So this is in an asymmetrical time signature. So this is an example of progressive metal, like Tool. But this is Between the Buried and Me. So vocals are very different here. So we have a growl, right? And there's different types of growling. So he's got more of a growl going on. There's vocal fries, which not fries like French fries, but a fry like that's a fry. People make fun of folks in the valley, SoCal folks, because they talk like this. That's a vocal fry. It's actually not very good for your vocal cords. So there's an example of vocal fry in deathcore. I'll let you hear. This is another example of progressive metal. Now, this is Devin Townsend project, and this is a song called Kingdom, probably his most famous song. And one of the things that I love about Devin Townsend is dude can really sing, and you'll hear it here in a moment. He's an amazing guitar player, a multi-instrumentalist, but his voice is out of this world. Very operatic, very strong. You hear some female vocalists going right now. Right? You might hear some vocal fry coming up. Yeah, no vocal fry, but amazing, right? Like, his voice is like to be envied. So those are three of my favorite examples of progressive metal. Nothing really musically setting Devin Townsend's Kingdom apart from other types of metal in that excerpt, but later in the song you'll hear some more progressive elements. Another element of metal is the drop, right? So let me get back to this is an extreme example of the drop. This is back to Between the Buried and Me. Now, this song is called White Walls, and this is how they there's an album that they did called Colors, and this is the second to the last track. And another thing that kind of sets progressive metal apart from other types of metal is that typically you want to listen to the album as a whole. The album is intended to be listened to in one sitting for a lot of these guys. I know that's true for Tool, and I know that's true for Between the Buried and Me. So yeah, here we go. White Walls, here's an example of the drop. So I got you before the drop. That way we can listen to the lead up to the drop, which is almost just as fun because it's that aspect in music that we love so much called delayed gratification, which is why drops in metal and drops in dubstep are amazing, and the musicians who create these drops know that, so they really build the intensity before. This drop is about 9.5 minutes into the song, so I fast forwarded to that. All right. So all these musical elements going all over the place. Progressive metal. Playing around with time signature. Playing around with rhythm. The drop. So they take another 4 minutes to close that track from that amazing emotional peak. Very groovy here. Love that. Love that. That song, like what a way to close an album, which they let you down a little gentler. There's a track at the end of that album that finishes with piano, which the album starts with piano, so it ends with that same theme. It's all tied and threaded together throughout the rest of the album, but that's the drop. I have another example of a drop for you too. Let's see. This is a deathcore band called Asbloodrunsblack. So we talked about the drop, and we talked about it being an element of metal. We also talked about how the lyrics are an emotional expression and validation of anger sometimes. But it also is just a way to validate your emotional experience as the artist. You know, so they're really conveying. It's like one of the reasons why, I don't know, Picasso would choose a certain color or choose a certain shape to represent a part of something he was doing, be it a sculpture or a painting. So these musicians are choosing these screams and distorted guitar as a way to validate their emotional experience. And the reason metalheads like myself love it is because we have similar emotional experiences that are validated in the same ways, right? So if you're mad about politics, these guys there's a whole section of metal, which I think it kind of bridges most sections of metal that are mad about some of these societal things. It's really about being mad at unfairness, either to yourself or to someone else who you support. So you'll find elements of that as well in metal. So here's another example of a drop. This is different. This is a deathcore drop, which most drops sound similar in their emotional presentation, but for the most part, you're going to have some tension in the music, and it's kind of fast, and then it builds up, and then you drop. And it slows it down. Some people call it a type of playing there a junt or a chug, because the guitars are versus so you'll lead up to it sometimes with that. My very excellent air guitar playing. Okay, so here we go. This is a song called Hester Prynne by Asbloodrunsblack, and here's the drop from that song. So, fast drums, relatively fast guitar, but the rhythm is accented. All right, so you'll notice this, the vocal style here has changed a lot too. Though in White Walls, you have, let's see. So, type of screaming here versus, let's go ahead and jump into chealseagrin, deathcore. The deathcore vocal style is different. And that's kind of what sets it apart. You have what seems like a drop in the beginning. So you'll hear a growl lower, and at the same time another vocalist doing a vocal fry. All right, so that is deathcore, which is like a combination of a few different other types of metal. It's got punk elements in it, which isn't metal at all. But it's also got some progressive elements in there. There's a subgenre which I'm not going to talk about at all called math metal, where it seems like you need to know mathematics to play it. Which is how I always interpreted math metal, the name. So let's see. So we talked about the drop, and I didn't give you a listening example to groove metal, right? So Lamb of God here is groove metal, but it's I call them groove metal. They're kind of on their own. So here's some of their music. Now, Lamb of God is highly anti-political. But you hear the elements are very straightforward musically. All right, so his singing is a little more intelligible than some of their music. Is not just Lamb of God and groove metal, but a lot of metal can focus on apocalyptic themes. You'll see that in doom metal, which doom metal really refers to the aesthetics, the sound of it. It sounds like doom. It is slow. It's a dirge. It is slow typically, whereas this you can hear like some elements that are really groovy. Lamb of God is also known for having really hellacious mosh pits. And actually the frontman Randy Blythe spent some time in jail overseas. I don't remember where, but for inciting, like someone either got fatally wounded or seriously wounded in one of their mosh pits, and he got put in jail until they could figure out if he incited it, which he got out of jail. They found out he didn't incite it, but there's that physical element of expression when you go to the shows too. There's gonna be pushing. There's also room at the back for people like me who have no need to do that anymore. I did it when I was younger, when I would go to shows. But there's always room at the sides in the back for people who don't want to mosh, and people are always very respectful. If you get knocked down or if you get hit and you didn't want to be, people are apologetic. So yeah, it's really something. The community around metal is pretty interesting. So I wanted to bring up one last element of metal. Very important one, logos. So it's kind of a meme within some subgenres of metal that you have sometimes unintelligible or illegible logos. So this big one that I have pulled up here, let's see if I can. Yeah. Sorry, I'm I don't know any other way to do this but to just drag it here. You'll see some are highly readable, like Sepultura right there, that second one down on the left. Slayer, you can read that. But it's almost like the further right and down you get, the less you can tell what it is. Here's another one. These are black metal bands. They are known for their logos being highly illegible. Though you can, I mean, the one down at the bottom with the pentagram is clearly black flame. I love this part of metal. This one, what is this? Who is that? What band is that? You can't read it. I'm not making this up. This is another logo. This is a metal band logo. That has within it the metal band's name. It's amazing. I love it. So this is where they came from, right? So metal band starter pack. Who doesn't need a good starter pack? So I'll call them OG metal. Those three there in the beginning: Metallica, Pantera, Megadeth. That's OG metal, which I'm going to talk about in part 2. Which some people might argue that, but I'm calling it OG metal because that's the first that I was familiar with. So all of these have fangs in some way in this column. In the middle column, you got chicken scratch, so it's kind of scribbly. You see at the very bottom there. Actually, all of them but Slipknot are kind of difficult, except for Infant Annihilator. You can read that one. And then the far right, angular, right? So you got something going on, very 80s-ish, right? Everything in the 80s was kind of angular in some way or another when it came to logos, and that's true for these bands, which were all popular in the 80s. I believe. I'm pretty sure they were all popular in the 80s. Let's see if we can get... Oh, here's a color one. Get that lined up for you there. Yeah. There's a guy on YouTube called Jared Dines. I think it's called Jared. His name's pronounced Jared Dines. Where he goes to a metal concert and he's going outside, either where people are smoking or where they're just lined up to get into the show. And they're wearing metal band t-shirts. And he asked them to name 3 songs by the artist whose shirt they're wearing. Really good, really funny. It's amazing to me how many people don't know anything about the artist whose shirt they're wearing. It seems kind of basic to me. Par for the course, you should probably know their music. So a couple of years ago, I wrote down, and it might not have been even a couple of years ago. It might have been last year. I had a podcast called Nevermind Who Listens, which is kind of on a permanent hiatus at this point. This was end of last year, end of 2019. I did an episode here that's on explicit content. And there's part of that is relative to what I'm talking about now when it comes to metal and perception of metal. So I'd like to read a little bit from the transcript of that, just because I feel like I kind of said it well then, and I'll say it now. So in 1995, I don't know if anybody remembers Phil Donahue, but he had a talk show, kind of iconic glasses and blondish white hair. But he was one of those talk show hosts that would set people up or try to set people up for all these gotcha moments. which he thought he had Marilyn Manson set up for a gotcha. But what he failed to realize, and what his audience failed to realize, is that Marilyn Manson is highly intelligent and very well spoken. People make assumptions about him based on how he looks. So that's the other part of metal too, is the look, right? So probably on the extreme of that, which Manson stands on the shoulders of like these shock rockers, like Alice Cooper, for example. Iggy Pop was another one. Gigi Allen was even more extreme, but Manson was standing on the shoulders of these guys. And then there's also like black metal, where it's pretty standard to see white face paint with black around the eyes and the mouth, to kind of give the look of a corpse, which black metal is an extreme subgenre of metal, which I'm going to talk about in part 2 as well. So anyway, so back in 1995, Phil Donahue's talking to Marilyn Manson, and he's kind of chastising Manson and trying to make a mockery of like his physical appearance and his music, which, if you know anything about Manson or any artist, their representation of themselves, the costumes. I mean, think of Lady Gaga. It's a representation of who they are. It's a part of their overall art. So Manson's this shock rocker standing on the shoulders of these giants, Alice Cooper and Gigi Allen and Iggy Pop. And Manson feeds off of making people feel uncomfortable while he's singing about controversial topics, which is true for a lot of metal. No one else really did it like Marilyn Manson did it in the 90s. And, I was a teenager in that time, and I felt like really encouraged and validated by his protest of normal social standards. And, other people, it was kind of like a car accident. It was kind of, they were glued to every moment, and it was difficult to look away. And like they were bearing witness to something vulnerable someone else is going through, but they didn't totally understand exactly what that person was going through at the moment. So that music, for me, was an outlet and was important to a lot of other people, though the greater majority of like news outlets, and you'll still see it sometimes, and politicians are opposed to metal. And another genre of music that gets thrown in there too is rap and hip-hop. And it's not for any other reasons that the artists in those genres are not afraid to talk about things that are controversial. They're not afraid to go there. So, these news outlets and these politicians are very quick to damn the music and say that it's a cause of violence and suicide. It's a cause of self-harm, and it's a negative influence on people. And that's just not true. The same people, the same news outlets and politicians are saying the same thing about first-person shooter video games, like the original one of Doom, or their fighting games like Mortal Kombat. But what we know to be true is that isn't true. Like anything else, there's exceptions. People who listen to that music do harm themselves, and sometimes they do harm others. And they claim music or video games as that driving force. But it has to be understood that something else internally is probably going on for these folks. This music, not just Manson, but most of the rock and rap of the 90s and current, and the video games, those first-person shooter games and those fighting games are outlets for aggression and self-deprecation. The music's validating, and it meets emotional experiencing with emotional validation. It gives meaning to what someone in depression might be feeling. Granted, the music can bring people down, and the fact of the matter is that depressive music can also make people feel sadder and more depressed. In those situations, the music's not the reason for that depression or self-harm behavior, but it's a cog in the machine that's driving that behavior. Typically, there's underlying mental illness that hasn't been addressed, and it's those cases on which media tend to focus, and they neglect all the other parts of the stories to push an agenda or a holier-than-thou politics, and grandstanding to stay in office. So the greater majority of people listening to metal and rap in the 90s and currently are listening to it for validation and self-expression. Now, granted, that's the biggest reason that people listen to music at all. So, in this case, the music was the language of parts of the selves of the people that were listening to it that possibly wasn't being expressed in any other medium that met their needs in their life. So they were drawn together. Something that I've talked about during this is community, right? So rap and hip-hop and metal or rock in general have these strong communities that you don't really see in other genres of music. Like you'll see that some artists have strong fan bases, but is that a supportive community? How many people will punch you in the face and then pick you up and say that was great? Other than being in a mosh pit. So the folks who are listening to this music are drawn together as a community for so many different reasons other than the lyrical content of the music. So this is kind of the birth of mosh pits or rebirth. So mosh pits in the 1970s and 80s kind of came to be in the punk era in Los Angeles. And punk rock is what paved the way for the artists of the 90s. And I'm kind of focusing on the music of the 90s here to talk about this, and it's a little selfish because it's some of my favorite music. But I also think that other than the late 60s, the 90s mainstream rock music scene was more flexible in the amount of creativity that was allowed. So the music business then actually seemed to care about the way music was influential and how it was important from an artistic sense, and it seemed less financially driven, which is another element of metal that I enjoy too. You see a bunch of independent labels pushing bands. It's not really financially driven. It's always money, right? You want to get paid for the things that you're good at doing. But it's less so. The creative energy behind it is less so driven by finances as much as it's driven by the need for expression and the need to feed that community with that emotional expression. So that's all I'll say about explicit content, right? Because metal music is loaded with explicit content, and language is like just, it's barely crossing the threshold when it comes to explicit content in metal. And I think that's all I'll say about that. So what else? We talked about everything I'd written. And we listened to some good tunes. So I hope if you were listening to this or watching this for educational purposes or self-care purposes, I hope it was enlightening for you. You probably learned something about me you didn't know, which is that because most of the time I'm not sharing metal, and I explained why in the beginning of the video, is that I can't recreate the essence and aesthetics of what needs to be expressed for metal to work. So you learned that I'm a huge metalhead. It's what I listen to most of the time. Not kidding. So, like I said, this is part 1. I'm planning 3 parts. So, and I'm only going to talk about this once a week, right? So I'm not going to pick this up on Thursday. So on Tuesdays for the next couple more weeks, we're going to be talking about metal. I'll do something different on Thursday. So part 2, I'm planning on talking about what I call OG metal, which is just metal, right? It's not progressive metal, it's not groove metal, it's not deathcore. It's just metal, like Metallica. I'd like to talk about instrumental metal, which you heard some of, which is Scale the Summit. And then, which was the intro music. I'll give you some different outro music today too. And then lastly, on part 2, I want to talk about black metal, which is where they, folks wear all the white face paint and black eyes and very corpse-like. It's very, very extreme in its content, and I probably won't play much of their music, but I want to talk about it because it is an important part of metal. And then part 3, I'd like to talk about doom metal and thrash and other considerations for metal, because it's difficult to identify some of these subgenres, and they sound similar even to somebody like me who's been listening to it for a while. There's a lot of similarities there, so that's kind of the other considerations, because I want to be respectful of all the music that's included there. So yeah, if you have any questions about metal or the clinical applications of it, I'd love to talk more about it, get a discussion going. You can reach out to me on Twitter at DeanQuickMTBC, or in the comment section anywhere you're watching this video. I'm going to get some music queued up for the outro, and I'll see you tomorrow at 10 a.m., where I'm going to provide some live looping. Not sure the theme of that yet, but I'll get some live looping going for you tomorrow at 10 a.m. So take care. I hope you've got a new appreciation for metal today, and I'll catch you next time.